Museum, São Paulo Art Museum, and many others. She is also the member of the Committee of the Society for Utopian Studies, which is an international interdisciplinary network devoted to the study of utopianism in its multiple forms. Thank you so much again, Julia. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Is this mic working? Can you hear me properly? Yes? If not, I'll just take yours, Basil.
Yeah, just press the button.
Okay. This one works better. Okay. Well, today I'm going to probably do a lecture which has to do with Almira Osmanova's lecture yesterday, I think. It's, from what I read in the abstract, I think it has something to do with what I'm going to speak about today, and actually I will want to watch the video once I return to Barcelona. And my lecture has to do with the idea of finding common languages, which is something which is fundamental in forming alliances. And it's a lecture which is going to dwell between the local and the transnational, and with also the idea of alliances that go beyond borders, not only geographical borders, but also even ideological borders, and which have to do with traditions of different activist movements. And a question which will be kind of unconsciously surmounting the lecture will be that of the idea that a common language can very easily turn into a new canon. And what I will present today has been, I think we can consider it a kind of a canon for creative activism. So I think this is an idea which we can think about in a context such as this, and I will be very happy to learn more about how this resonates in the context of the East Europe Biennial Alliance. So I'm going to tell you a collection of stories, and these stories will travel through geographies, as Basil said, mostly from Western Europe. And I'm going to start with a very local story, which has resonations which are echoing with more global geographies. And so I will begin by talking about the British Anti-Rhodes movement and the squatted street of Claremont Road, which was a street in London. But before I go deeper on that, this story, although I will not speak about it directly, begins when, at the end of 1989, a crowd tried to cross the Berlin Wall from both sides and breaking through the barrier. And when soon afterwards, in 1990, the demolition work started, and as you all know, in 1991, the USSR was dissolved. The UK was a different history, and in the beginning of the 1990s, the consequences of the 11 years of ruling of Margaret Thatcher were already apparent. Her government, which involved privatization, deregulation, cuts, repressive policing, in a combination which has been known as Thatcherism, was now followed by her inheritor, John Major, which inherited many of her policies, including a megalomaniac program for building roads called Roads for Prosperity, which had been sold as the biggest road building program ever since the Romans. And this project will generate a series of dissident movements from neo-pagan and anarchist perspectives, whose ideas will be linked to the complex countercultures of the UK in this period. An example, okay, sorry, I had this, it's not exactly synchronized. This movement has a strong precedent in the anti-nuclear movement, which existed in the 1980s in the UK, and which had some of its protagonists linked to groups which are not traditionally linked to certain views of activism, which is linked to militantism and to physical violence. In this sense, the Greenham Common Peace Camp was a very significant example. It was a peace camp that sprung around military bases of Greenham Common, and it was a peace camp constituted only by women, which lived there for 20 years, constituting a very complex camp which had different doors which were identified by different colors, which had to do with different areas of this camp, and which you could conceive of like a multifaceted rainbow of colors coming together, like this rainbow that the women were creating as a decoration of the fence, which was around the military bases. These women would conduct various strategies of civil disobedience, of sabotage, and of blockade of the military base, and some included enclosing the military base, and some included opening the military base, such as in this image of one of the various times in which the woman cut up the base in order to enter. And I really like this image of these kind of ladylike women entering the military area. They look like, you know, like you would say mothers in Spanish, these kind of urban tribe women, which are really not linked to certain images of protest. And I want to keep this in mind, and also to keep in mind this idea of the colors, which we will find later on in the lecture, because what we are thinking about here is about this reconceptualizing of utopian dissidence after the Berlin Wall. The Greenham Common Peace Camp managed their immediate purpose of making nuclear missiles away from the zone of Greenham Common. And just 1 year after they managed this, which was in 1991, in 1992, a group of New Age travelers, these were kind of hippie people linked to the British countercultural who lived a nomadic lifestyle traveling through the UK. A group of these people just camped in a site, which was a site called Twyford Down, and they became fascinated by the environment, and they became appalled to learn that this environment was going to disappear because they were going to build a final section there of the M3 motorway as a part of this Roads for Prosperity plan. So they decided to stay there and to defend the place by their own presence. So they built this very precarious camp with a tipi tent and with these aesthetics, which led them to consider themselves a tribe, the Donga tribe, which practiced several acts of disobedience which gained them major media attention, and also a very strong adherence from many people from different parts of the country and also different parts of society. And this gave birth to a very strong movement which was countrywide, which was a new iteration of an Anti-Rhodes movement which practiced this form of intervention which consisted in creating protest camps which were placed in the way of future roads. And some of these protest camps got very complex forms, such as the 14 aerial villages of Newbury, which were built in 1995 and which, as you can see in the image, required certain circus abilities to manage or to navigate. This context of this movement, which was mostly taking place in the countryside, changed when in 1993 the work began for the M11 environment, and for the first time this projected road was going to demolish 3 neighborhoods of London. So this not only meant the felling down of trees and the disappearing of ecological landscapes, but also the forced displacement of many neighbors, and also some 300 houses being demolished. So the process was the same as in the ecologist anti-Rhodes movement. Just there was legal battle which failed, and then some activists went there, some countercultural activists, and installed themselves and started conducting actions of sabotage. So they would run away from the guards, they would climb trees, they would do tree houses, and they would also climb on the machines in order to stop the functioning of the machines, and they would also chain themselves to the machines. So these actions slowed down construction, And however, they did not stop it completely. So the activists were gradually turning back, until the only part that was left without being demolished was a single street called Claremont Road, which was composed of 30 Victorian houses, and which was completely squatted by November. We are talking of November 1994. And in this moment, it seemed clear that they were going to be evicted, that it was something that was going to happen sooner or later. So people who installed themselves there started thinking of the place as something which had meaning in itself, and which was constituting itself as a temporary autonomous zone, to use the terminology of that period, which was a terminology that was widely used, and which is a term invented by the poet, the anarchist poet Hakim Bey, to speak of anarchist areas which do not seek to be permanent, but which see their impermanence as a form of power, as a form of being pure, and as a form of not having to compromise. So the activists in Claremont Road, they were squatters. There were lots of artists also, because the buildings had begun to be cheaper before the road building programs started. So there was a motley environment of people with different approaches, which intervened collectively in the streets, creating a kind of massive installation. What you can see with the tires are barricades, you can see tree houses, you can see lots of objects creating kind of sculptures. The walls were painted with different images as if the houses were still inhabited. All of the roads were painted, and also the floors were painted, and rubbish was repurposed, and also elements from sabotage were repurposed. So you can see certain parts of machinery from cars that were in the area and that were broken, bricks from the demolishment of other buildings, and all of these were repurposed into creative interventions, such as this chest that can be read as kind of an image of this battle that they were taking part with the state. Also, cars would acquire a very strong symbolic importance, and they were circulation was cut off from the street. So the cars that were left there were turned into kind of what one of the activists called John Jordan, who was an artist who stopped being an artist in order to put his imagination into the service of social movements. John Jordan talked about them as monuments to the end of the car culture. So one of the most iconic was this Rust and Peace car, in which a car which has no longer a use as a car has become like a place in which flowers can bloom, as a metaphor also of a new society. Different countercultures of the past were coming together, and the iconography of this place, which worked as a kind of a palimpsest. And there was this daisy chain which was covering and connecting all of the 30 Victorian houses by the outside. And on the inside it had kind of a parallel in a tunnel that was made so that activists could chain themselves to the wall in the moment of eviction, and making it more complicated to be evicted. And this is important to say because all of the elements in Claremont Road were not merely a decoration, but they had to do with what Gavin Grindon and Catherine Flood have termed disobedient objects. They were objects which were in the service of actions of civil disobedience. So this was not a place for contemplation. This was a place that was built as a kind of festival. And actually, in the summer, when there was gigantic parties every Sundays, they termed the place as a festival of resistance. And let's keep also this term in mind, because it will reappear later. So after the summer, we are now in the winter. The big spectacle of Claremont Road started, and this was the eviction by the police. This was a spectacle that was thought of from the beginning, and that's the moment in which the statues became barricades, and in which a complex system of different elements was put into practice. The street had a system of tactical weightlessness, and this makes us think of a whole tradition of art history passing through Yves Klein's iconic Jump into the Void, a whole tradition which has dreamed of overcoming the force which attracts bodies to the ground. Also, Russian constructivism and Soviet avant-gardes have a very strong tradition towards this kind of utopian aim. And you could see a connection with a whole system of tactical weightlessness, which was built on Claremont Road. The activists created a tower, and they called it Dolly's Tower, because there was a very old woman living in the street who didn't want to leave. She just stayed with the activists and said that they were the grandchildren that she never had. So the activists named it Dolly's Tower in her honor. And connected to this tower were a system of networks through which activists separated themselves physically from the police, and through which they also gave each other things that were needed, such as food or instruments. Parallel to this system, there was also activists which were buried in 4 underground bunkers, and there was also a tunnel giving electricity, because in the tower there were enormous sound systems which began the music of a gigantic rave when the police arrived. So the activists described the reaction of policemen, really not understanding what was happening because they were there to evict them and people were just dancing. So there was a strong reflection about this idea of turning the eviction into something which was a spectacle. And Justin, which was one of the activists, said that Claremont Road was opera, it was dramatic opera. And he said that one of the meanings of activism was that it succeeded in bringing 1,000 people to watch a scene. And he would say, we bring all these people in to watch, we bring coppers, policemen, we bring security guards, bailiffs, TV crews to see something that they wouldn't see otherwise. They've got to get their heads around it afterwards. So this idea of repurposing the eviction in order to turn it into a spectacle would be something that social movements would be working on a very conscious basis after this. There was a certain moment in which the electricity got cut for all of the street, and then the underground tunnel gave electricity to the tower. And before of that, people were shouting power to the tower, as if they were asking for power in its 2 meanings in English, which has to do with political power and to electrical power. So this is a scene that will have to do with what George Mackay would term senseless acts of beauty practiced by activism in these years, and which seems to have had no practical influence because Claremont Road was evicted and it doesn't exist anymore. It's a street that does not exist. However, the road building program was abandoned in its totality, and if you cannot really prove that this had to do with the Anti-Rhodes movement, you really can prove that it had to do with the beginning of a new social movement which will be very influential and which will be called Reclaim the Streets. So Reclaim the Streets was a very small ecologic direct action group which had been created in 1991. It had dissolved, and after the experience of the rave parties in Claremont Road, it reunited with a very particular dimension. And this new dimension also had to do, if you look at the tower in Claremont Road, it says, defy the Criminal Injustice Act. Do you see it in the tower? Over there. So this new direction in Reclaim the Streets, which was starting to work again together, had to do with a new legislation which was called the Criminal Justice Act, and which was passed along just before the eviction of the musical eviction of Claremont Road. And this legislation was criminalizing different acts which had to do with the British countercultural environment, and it was giving new powers to the police, and it was also turning into criminal offense practices which had to do with squatting, with trespassing land, and with celebrating rave parties. So actually the celebration of rave parties were explicitly criminalized through the legislation, which talked about listening to repetitive beats. So this had to do with a new form of action. So on the 14th of May of 1995, two cars crashed violently into each other in London, and their drivers went out of the cars and started breaking each other's cars in a moment of what you call road rage in Great Britain. And so the clashing of these cars in Camden Town blocked the street. And this blocking of the street was really no accident, because the cars had been rented by members of the Reclaim the Street collective, and this was actually one of the first strategies that they used to block a road. And this blocking of the road was to turn the road rage into a road rave. So about 300 people started dancing in what was the first party of this collective, which would bring to the foreground slogans such as breathe, car free, and most notably, reclaim the streets. So these parties would grow in number very quickly. So only 2 months afterwards, this attendance of 300 people would become 3,000. So the attendance had grown tenfold. And as you probably all know, this has to do with the context of rave parties, which were taking place in Great Britain at the time. But what Reclaim the Streets was doing, it was politicizing it explicitly and linking the situation of the party to what you can call prefigurative politics, and with the idea of creating in the here and now a moment and a situation that speaks of other possible worlds in which you can experience the city without money, without authority, and through practices of sharing and through pleasure. So in the second party, there was also a scene which had to do with bridging political mythologies and political poetics through time. And there was a lorry who brought sand from the street, from a beach, and put it on top of the cobblestones. And it seemed like they were reversing this famous slogan from May 68 that says that under the cobblestones, the beach. In 1996, there was one of the most iconic parties in July 1996. And in this, there was two stilt walkers who were walking up and down the street. And they were playing bagpipes, and as you can see, they were surrounded by police. This time, the people were just dancing in a motorway called M41, which they had accessed after breaking a very strong police cordon. So these stilt walkers were walking up and down the street. They were playing bagpipes, and they were just moving around. And because of the general tumult and the general noise and also the music of the rave party, you could not hear something that was happening, and which had to do with the presence of activists from Reclaim the Streets, which were underneath those skirts, and they were using jackhammers and pneumatic drills to drill the floor, and on the floor plant these trees, which had been recovered from the area of the Claremont Road. So they were literally playing again with this idea of what is underneath the pavement, and about creating this image of nature coming back. And at this party, there was a leaflet that said as follows: "We are about taking back public space from the enclosed private arena. At its simplest, it's an attack on cars as a principal agent of enclosure. It's about reclaiming the streets as a public, inclusive space from the private, exclusive use of the car. But we believe in this as a broader principle, taking back those things which have been enclosed within capitalist circulation and returning them to collective use as a commons. Under the tarmac, the forest." So we have this idea of using these creative parties as a form of creating common land, and also as a form of piercing time and bringing back the commons to England. So by this time, this Reclaim the Streets parties were already taking place all over the UK, and in 1997 they started to take place also in other countries, and Reclaim the Streets was no longer the name of a collective, it was the name of a practice, which became kind of a vernacular of activist movements. And in 1998, the first global street party took place, and in 1999, the second global street party took place under the name of the Carnival Against Capital. The group from London was organizing this festivity. This festivity was taking place in the financial centers of different cities. So in London it took place in the city. And there they were using this quote from what they thought was Raoul Vaneigem. Well, now we know they made a mistake, they also know. Which said that organizing to work for delight and authentic festivity is barely undistinguishable from preparing for a general insurrection. And at this moment they had an idea of how to make the police not know where they were going. So they gave people who showed up masks with different colors. Once more we have the strategy of the colors. And these colors had to do with the different bases, just the different ideologies linked to the movement. A green one was linked to ecology, a red one was linked to socialism, a black one was linked to anarchism, and then a golden one had to do with the place where they were going to dance, which was the place of money. So each color were to follow one of these giant-headed figures, which had to do with a representation of different social movements throughout the world. And each group would follow a different route in order to make the police not know what was their actual direction. So in the end, they all arrived at the City of London in front of the Life building. And there they also opened a fire extinguisher with the idea of unearthing an underground river. And they also filled the space with banners which were meant to repurpose the stage and change its meaning, turning it into a place where anti-capitalist and ecologic lemmas and ecologic motives were expressed, such as this: the earth is not a casino for the rich, or the earth is a common treasury for all, which is a phrase which was attributed to the leader of the Diggers, which was a group, medieval group, which in the 17th century, not medieval, sorry, but kind of a medieval frame of mind, which in the 17th century went to live into the common land and said that they would give everything for free. So it's also this idea of the traditions of struggle and the idea of creating a place of leisure in which the dreamed world and the ways in which you fight to get it are getting together. And this brings to mind plebeian fantasies such as the land of cocaine. I don't know if you have an equivalent here in Eastern Europe. It would be lovely to learn about this. But there's a whole tradition in Western Europe of a mythical land where everything is abundant and where birds fly already cooked and enter your mouths, and there's a river of milk and honey. So it's this idea of the place of abundance and not the place of scarcity, which they were dreaming of. And in the Carnival Against Capital, the group was so successful that they were, they thought that they were under-ambitious because they thought that they would have been able to squat the buildings, and they actually were able to get inside the financial buildings. And in this sense, John Jordan again says that you could start by this to create this other possible world. And he said, the street party is only a beginning, a taster for future possibilities. To date, there have been 30 parties all over the country. Imagine that growing to 100. Imagine each one of those happening on the same day. Imagine each one lasting for days on end and growing. Imagine the street party growing roots, la fête permanente, or the permanent party. So this idea was being put forward to the group, and something which is interesting, and maybe we can go back to this on the questions, was that at this moment the group was being spied upon. There was one of the 10 people who knew the final place was a spy from the police, and yet the police did not stop the party. We do not know exactly why. John Jordan thinks that it was because there was already the planning for a global event, which was the protests of Seattle in 1999. And he thinks that they wanted to watch how this new social agent was moving. We will never know, and it would be great to know also your opinions. But Reclaim the Street would be very interesting, not only in an organizational manner, but also through its forms of aestheticizing protest and through the way in which they were proposing a common language in which to speak of protest and in which to develop protest. When Reclaim the Streets started going back together, there was already this insurrection in Mexico by the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which had been responding to the expanding role of global capitalism, which was already visible after the fall of the Berlin Wall on a bigger scale, even though it had been creating itself through transnational organizations, mostly since the 1970s, although this is a date that we can discuss about the beginnings of neoliberalism. But in 1994, in Mexico, an indigenista group in the Lacandonan jungle of Chiapas rose up against the government, and this had to do with the coming into effect of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, between Canada, Mexico, and the USA. The government in Mexico would stop repressing this army only after, I think it was 19 days, let me check, after only 12 days of armed rebellion because of the pressures that they were receiving from the rest of the country. However, when they started repression again, the Zapatista army went on to focus on the international networks, and so they launched a cry for help, which in its turn made certain networks form in Western Europe, and this meant that different social movements were coming together in order to help the Zapatistas or in order to give this international support. And in one of these meetings in Berlin, they received an invitation to go to an encuentro, a meeting, in the Lacandonan jungle. So in the Lacandonan jungle, this was in 1996, in the summer, in the Aguascalientes Zapatistas, in the month of July, there began a number of meetings between social movements from all over the world who had traveled there and started to discuss common strategies. This became a kind of a tradition, so the next summer there was another encuentro, this time in different places of Spain, and in the second encuentro, they started to discuss the idea of creating a common platform to organize. So this common platform turned into the People Global PTA, the People Global Action Network, yeah, PTA. And this was behind the organizing of the first Global Street Party, which we talked about with Reclaim the Streets, and also the second Global Street Party. And the third Global Street Party was the very famous mobilizations in Seattle. So in Seattle, what was happening through the decade was coming together for the first time in a North American scale. So this meant that the scenery was a central stage in which all of the communication media were pointing. It was a place where all of the cameras were pointing. And in this place, all the different groups were coming together under the metaphor of carnival. And Naomi Klein was speaking of a coming out party of all of these movements which had been coming together in the 1990s and which were now presenting themselves as if through a common dance. So the metaphor of the carnival was very strong at that moment, and you can see through this viewpoint the different strategies also in relating to the protest language and also in relating to the ways of relating to the police. So for example, there was many acts of iconoclasm directed towards the transnational companies such as Nike, as you can see in the image. And these These forms of intervention were also coming together with the major forms of intervention in Seattle, which had to do with the planning of a gigantic blockade, which meant just activists joining hands in the streets and just preventing the delegates from the World Trade Organization, which were meeting in Seattle, preventing them from getting to the Sheraton Hotel where they were supposed to meet, just by the mere presence in the street. So it was a strategy which was very similar to the Anti-Rhodes movement in the way of opposing the body, of it being a very physical form of disobedience and direct action. In Seattle, there was a strong repression, a strong physical repression. You can see also in the background that it was Christmas. This is something that one normally doesn't kind of think about in Seattle, this kind of Christmas environment for the protests. But this repression had something of frustration, because this strategy of just being in the street, so many people in the street from very different backgrounds. There were Christians, there were anarchists, there were feminists, there were people from trade unions, all of these different people coming together through the metaphor of carnival. There were lots of people disguised as tortoises also, this kind of early environmentalism. All of these had been successful, and the delegates from the World Trade Organization could not arrive to their place of meeting. So this was so successful that it prompted a whole wave of what was to be called the Counter Summit, which meant that at the same time as these transnational powerful organizations such as the World Trade Organization or the World Bank was meeting, a whole meeting of activists would take place at the same time and in the same area and try to prevent the powerful meeting from taking place. But what also happened in Seattle is that the whole aesthetic of the ways in which protest is conceived and presents itself was put into the foreground and was turning into a global language, into a transnational language, and maybe we could discuss if it was turning into a canon. So this idea of the crowd, a homogeneous crowd, going from point A to point B, kind of dressed together, serious, responsible, walking like in a military parade, this idea was being mixed by this other idea. This is a party by Reclaim the Streets. So this model of protest was blended with this other model of protest, and Subcomandante Marcos, the leader of the Zapatista Army for National Liberation, would say that the protest has now turned into a kind of a carnival. So following this metaphor of the carnival, you can see also the first major European protest, which took place in 2000 in Prague, and where different groups were associated with different colors. And these different colors, once more, like what happened in London and the city, were following different routes to arrive to the same place. So these different colors were associated with different ideologies and would also become associated with different strategies to having relationships with the police. So the yellow color was for a socialist kind of group, which was called the Tutte Bianche, the white overalls, which were a group of people linked to the squatted social centers from Italy. Sorry, the silence of drinking. And they wore white overalls because they were, in the beginning, trying to express this idea of being like ghosts for the system, because there was a mayor who wanted to evict a mythical social center and said that squatters would become like ghosts, so they started to dress like that as if embodying ghosts. But then the white overall also turned into a way of visibilizing those that were invisible to the system. So immigrant workers without papers, or precarious workers, and unemployed people, and different forms of citizenship and non-citizenship, which were invisible. They also created DIY methods for clashing with the police. And thus, even if they were not carrying violent forms of confrontations explicitly, they maintained the mystique of the violent confrontation. So the police would try to make them go back, and they would just resist with their shields and with their protections, which were made in workshops just before the mobilizations. And in their collective body, they also remind of certain artistic projects, such as Lucy Orta's Nexus, which is more or less from the same time, from the early 2000s. So you can make us think of this idea of visibilizing the collective body through different metaphors. The blue line was a group in which the black bloc was included, and the black bloc is a technique, a tactic more than a technique, in which people wear black hoodies and different ways of making the face non-identifiable, and they practice violence, mostly against objects and against elements of the city. And this bloc had its own marching band, the Infernal Noise Brigade, which were creating music for the riots, and which were marching also with tear masks, so that they could continue playing amidst the tear gas. But what was most iconic about these mobilizations in Prague was Rosie Knobs, which you can see in this picture. This woman coming from the Reclaim the Streets, the squatters milieu. She invented an idea, which was the idea of tactical frivolity, and which was the idea of being ridiculous and using humor in a place where everybody is equipped for confrontation. So she was part of a group who came from England and who who conceived of themselves as inheritors of Reclaim the Streets. And they practiced a form of confrontation with the police, which was dancing samba and wearing ridiculous outfits of pink and silver, which depicted humorous and exaggerated femininity, understanding femininity as a disguise in the manner of Judith Butler, the performativity of femininity. And their strategy was actually the most successful, and they were the ones who arrived to the meeting place thanks to this tactic of just dancing and laughing and humor. And there's a lovely video in which you can see the policeman just backing off when she's just moving this pink wand towards them because of the mere just not understanding the situation. So this kind of shows the ways in which tactical frivolity can be used, and which were used in the following years. There was, for example, the Clown Army following this same principle, born in 2003. But of course, it has no place where there is actual violence taking place, as would happen the next year in the mobilizations of Genoa, in which the police killed a young man called Carlo Giuliani, who approached a police van with a fire extinguisher. And not only did they shoot him, but they also ran him down with the cars. And the next day, they would also go to the place where the activists were taking refuge, and where the journalists were also taking refuge. And they beat everybody down in the night in order to take the computers and to take away the stuff which could be incriminating. So in this circumstance, also a few months later, we're talking about summer, a bit later there was the downfall of the Argentinian economy, El Corralito, and a few months later, also very soon after these demonstrations, there was the fall of the Twin Towers in New York. So there was a moment, a circumstance which had changed a lot, and in which the humor was no longer adequate for this kind of interventions, and where also very soon the Iraq War would begin, and actually the Clown Army was formed in order to receive George W. Bush when he visited the UK, as a form of trying to continue these forms of tactical resistance beyond tactical frivolity, beyond the idea of the enormous counter-summits which have been turned into battlefields, and in which it's no longer really made sense to concentrate because they had turned just into enormous spectacles in which the very real violence was really not useful anymore and was becoming more and more dangerous. And these interventions also echoed the art world. When Bush visited the UK, there was this enormous installation, part of the Weather Project by Olafur Eliasson. And a certain group of artists went there and created the words "Bush go home" with their own bodies. And this leads us to the question of how activism was giving form to a new aesthetics and a new vocabulary, which was also being used in art. And you can see this in examples such as British artist Jeremy Deller, or also Sharon Hayes, which you can see her queer repurposing of the civil rights movement motto, "I am a man," or Santiago Sierra, the Spanish political artist, who was creating this gigantic no, which was very clearly based on this no that was used in the referendum against the dictatorship of Pinochet in Chile. So we have this environment, and we have a very long decade of the 2000s in which all these energies, which culminated in the very strong anti-war movement against the war of Iraq, but which nonetheless did not prevent the war, it seemed like a void, and I think it's something we have to think about what really happened in these long 2000s, what happened between 2003 and 2010, like where we can situate this, what seems like a Wumin collective called it a desert for activism. But what we do know is that in 2010, the situation seemed to explode. And some slogans were coming back, because slogans always come back from one struggle to another. So here you can see "No nos vamos," we are not leaving, which seems to be an echo of one of the Argentinian mottos of the very rich Argentinian social movements which followed the fall of their economy. And this motto was "No se va, el pueblo no se va." It doesn't go, the people, we won't go. So what had happened at this time, of course, was the fall of the bank Lehman Brothers, which was the beginning of an economic crisis in which we are still submerged, and which was particularly strong in some countries. And some countries, of course, have recovered more than others. And this led to austerity policies and to neoliberal policies in different forms of the world. And journalist Olga Rodriguez has spoken. She was researching, she has written extensively on the Egyptian revolution. And she was a journalist to talk about the Arab Spring in different countries. And she spoke of how, starting in 2010, the Arab Spring not only had to do with the fight against dictatorship and for the fight towards more democratic powers, but she says that it also had to do with the neoliberal measures and with the social cuts which were taking place in these countries. The Arab Spring started a network of revolutions, not only in the Arab world, but also in the Western world, where they got translated, and that's where I'm going to finish this this story, or this stories that lead to stories. And I'm going to finish with a very particular case and with a very particular night in which I was in the streets and where this whole research started, which was the 17th of May in Madrid, in which there was a gigantic assembly and people started sweeping the floor, and they started to put cardboard on the floor because they would make in this way like a mattress, a soft space, or a place also in which people would be less cold when sitting on the ground. And they also started to tie these ropes to street lamps and to tie them to certain statues which are in the center of Madrid, in the Puerta del Sol. And they started building a camp. And this camp was a very direct echo to this other camp in Egypt. And Olga Rodriguez, this journalist and researcher which I just spoke about, she tells of how these activists actually literally called her by the phone and asked them how it had been done in Egypt to camp in a central square. So Olga Rodriguez told them that they had just looked for food and they looked for a way of keeping warm, so that's what the Spanish activists did. The camp in Madrid had begun on the 15th of May after a big demonstration, which was a demonstration by different groups that were more or less new and which didn't have a very strong political tradition. On the first night, it wasn't really a camp per se, it was just people hanging around and talking and creating social media platforms. From the very first night, they divided themselves in committees, even if there was very few people, there were 40 people, but already they were creating committees and working groups and creating assemblies. So they were using rhetoric and a form of organizing which was coming directly from the squatters' organized groups, and which was also reproducing many of the traditions which were coming from the anti-globalization movement and which had been maintained through these countercultural spaces. I'm not going to talk a lot about the 15N because I want to leave some space for the room and to hear what you have to say about, how this resonates in this kind of context, in this kind of room. But some of the things that happened in the Puerta del Sol were very relevant aesthetically. 2021 marked the 10-year anniversary of this movement, the movement of the squares. And in this movement of the squares, certain aesthetic elements went into the global vocabulary of struggle. Some of them came from the Arab Revolution and mostly from Egypt, but others were more vernacular and had to do with an adaptation of these languages into a Western countercultural environment. So in the square there was a continual practice of making banners, and this continual practice of making banners had to do with also the continual practice of general assemblies, which were working as a kind of collective performances. These assemblies were of thousands of people, so more than a direct process of making decisions, they were enormous spectacles which spoke about the possibility of democracy. And moreover, these spectacles had a very strong use of the body as a form of collective communication through the sign language, that's in which you would express agreement by doing like this with the hands, or you would express disagreement, or you would ask the volume to be raised. So it seemed like a kind of collective choreographies that were taking place twice a day for hours and hours and hours, and in which very few decisions were taken, but in which people were very highly committed to take part, and there was this feeling of historical period. But it also had to do with the idea and the feeling that no voice can represent other voices, so that people would create their own banners in a rhythmatic environment in which everything was being changed all the time, and where one banner was continuously painted upon, and then another banner would be put on top of this. And this idea, this banner says, now that we have taken the street, we are going to take words. So it's this idea of democracy as something equivalent to the use of language. And this is also one of the limitations which you can see in the street. So I'm also going to bring you a selection of banners, and I'm going to leave this case study a bit open because I just did a selection for the Reina Sofia Museum because they are going to include these banners in the permanent collection of the museum. So now it's kind of this canonized moment in which it's entering the National Museum of Spain, all these productions. And this stall is the stall of the Documentation and Archive Committee, which is a self-organized committee which arose on the 5th day of the square, the 5th day of the camp, and which started collecting banners. And some of them just came directly from here, which is the Arts Committee, because so many banners were being done that some, and actually most of the ones which were being produced in the Arts Committee, they didn't have space to hang them on the square, so they just went directly into the archive, just went directly to be archived. So when you see the camp, you can see it from many perspectives. I would say that there are three important perspectives. One was the performative aspect, which you can see very strongly through the assemblies, but also through certain collective performances, which were staged at certain moments which were relevant for the camp, such as a moment in which it was there was a menace by the police for evictions, so everybody went together and they just went silent and did like this with the hands, and this was called a silent scream. A second dimension would be urban, because this was kind of a city within a city where there was nursing stalls, there was various food stalls, there was places where you would have psychological therapy, where you would have massage, where you could take care of the children, where you would have a library. It was like a city in small, like an ideal city, where everything was for free, there was no money, everybody was working because they wanted to, and even so there was these very long shifts, and all materials were donations. So it was kind of a very utopian environment. But the third way in which you can see it is like an enormous open air book, in which the population were writing collectively a treatise on how the economic crisis came to be, who were guilty of the economic crisis. So in this way, and this happened like once and for all, because the official narrative was that it was the Spanish people's fault that there was a crisis because we had been irresponsible. And this narrative was completely erased by the camp, where they were pointing fingers at politicians, bankers, and generally at the oligarchies that were managing the previous situation. So if you see the camp through the banners, this is a banner that says, "Please do not throw away your banner, bring it to the archive." Through reading the banners, you can see the camp as this kind of collective book, which is processual and which has certain thematic axis. It also has a very voluntary roughness. So there's a very raw element, which has to do with this idea of sincerity, of being honest. So there's a kind of unprofessionalism of the banners, which is very explicit. And the banners which were like printed through a printer, it would seem as if they were less authentic because they're kind of standardized and you can reproduce them. And what was more significant of the square was this kind of very DIY, very unactivist kind of banners, this appearance of having no previous experience. So I just want to finish by giving like a short gallery of these very rough banners which are kept in the archive and which serve kind of as like freezing the time of the square and freezing the languages of the square, and where you can see also not only what people were saying, because for example here you can say at the end Sol, which is the Puerta del Sol, the square where the camp was taking place, and Africa were smiling together and free. Many, you really don't understand what the context might be, but together they conform both a portrait of the political dimensions and the personal dimensions which were at play in this space, and also the functioning. This is, for example, things that people were asking for. They were asking for banners to be made about certain issues. Here you can see the spatial organization of the camp: library, politics group, a group which was talking about politics, economy, communication, information. Which banners were big? Because most of them were small. So one of the few big banners just says, "You are all the enemy." So it's negation more than a collective affirmation. There was agreement on what was the disagreement more than what is the agreement. Sorry. We are not merchandise in the hands of politicians and bankers. Violence is to have a 600 euro salary. This is like the metro station. There is a lot of urban iconographies. Think that the lambs will become wolves. If you do not let us dream, we will not let you sleep. We are not afraid. This no. Indignados, the outraged. more education, less corruption, many proposals for the electoral law, different forms of assemblies. This one is for long-term politics, so it's talking anti-capitalism, anti-patriarchy, and there was all these small groups managing different parts of the state for a dignified life with the same opportunities, economical democracy. Here we build, we do not destruct. Utopias are our future realities. Change without violence. It seems that we are alive. You can. An abstract banner. I also did a banner. This is not a banner. From the sea to the land, everything shall change or everything shall die. So it's also this recovering not only of the political language, but of the poetical dimensions of language, understood as the ultimate form of self-managing, not only self-managing the political expectations, but also their poetical ones. Nothing should stop us now, ever, sorry. Revolution is now. Reality is an agreement, and we are more than them. Now, fags and lesbians are also part of the working class. This is my foot, actually. Politicians go to unemployment, don't vote. I'm also fighting for you. Spatial banners. This is a sleeping place. Education makes us free. Right to homing, welcome public space, and you also find ways of speaking with other areas of the world, because the camp first was only in Madrid. Very soon it was also in Barcelona, and it was in many cities and villages across Spain, and also very soon it turned into the rest of the world. And it was working now as a Western phenomenon, and actually it was the people from New York went to Madrid and offered to pay travel tickets so that organizers from Madrid would go to New York and help organize Occupy Wall Street. So through Occupy Wall Street, all these languages of protest will enter the vernacular, and the vernacular of this language, and this has been unconfigurated by the PowerPoint, but it says that it's the middle ground between creative practices, activism, and communitarian practices, where these traditions of utopias of revolt are placed, and where this vernacular language is trying to give language to. And these places and these initiatives where they are looking in two directions at the same time, at the destruction of the previous order and at the building of a different world. So this is kind of the idea and where I want to finish. And I hope I think I'm exactly kind of in time. So.
Thank you so much for this impressive overview. It does, of course, resonates a lot with the local context, because this city and this country had its own time of squares, at least several times. So please raise your hand and I will assist you with the microphone. Yeah.
First, thank you very much for this amazing presentation. It was very interesting. And the question I have is also like an observation. A lot of times when people are talking about this topic, I noticed that maybe it's a stereotype. I know that in a lot of these protests it unites a lot of different groups, like competing groups, competing classes, but at the same time, like it works both ways. Like while a lot of times it's leftist organization or leftist or leaning individuals or groups that organize or at least kind of conceptualize these movements aesthetically as well. I think recent times have shown that they don't have like a monopoly on it. So I'm just wondering if you have anything to talk about how the same ideas can be used by rightists, or I don't want to equate the same thing, but like neo-fascist groups, and what we should like kind of look out for, and also how the governments react to this and how maybe they, what's the word, use it to their advantage. But this kind of aesthetics or like conceptualization of protests or acts?
I think it's just we would like to think that creativity and humor and having fun and liberating aesthetics is our patrimony, but it's not. It's just a language, and as a language, it can be used by anyone really. So I don't think there's much to do really. Just try to use the language better, but I think it's completely a question that we kind of leave behind. I remember being in a seminar about collectives in the Warburg Institute, and there was lots of people, everybody talking about collectives, nobody talking about extreme right-wing collectives. And of course they have their collectivism, and of course they have their communities, and yes, they do. And I think it's also a question of art history in a way. Like you can see if you study, for example, the 19th century, you will see that everybody is talking about medievalism, and the conservatives are saying that medievalism is really nice because, you know, there's religion and that people are separated in classes, and there's a very well-structured society and women know their place. But then you will have the socialist groups and the anarchist groups, and they will say that the Middle Ages is great because there was equalitarian, there was the common land, and there was community, and the society was not broken by capitalism. And they're all using the same aesthetics, and they all believe that this aesthetics is completely linked to their politics, but they're using the same aesthetics to say completely opposite things. So I think just, you know, I guess forms don't really have a direction.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I mean, I know this wasn't the focus of your lecture, but I was wondering if you could draw conclusions of the afterlife of these protests. So what protest movements, so what happens after they stop?
You mean in Spain, in the world, or?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned several. For instance, I don't know, like I just pick one example for the Arab Spring. You know, it's really also important to think what happened afterwards. So I mean, I know this was not your focus, and you mentioned several, but yeah, I don't know. I was just wondering if you can draw some conclusions.
I can speak mostly of the Spanish example because I have more of a situated perspective. The Spanish example is interesting because there was a wave of people who went into political power, and they came from the anti-globalization movement, but were legitimated by the 2011 movement. So it's interesting in the way in which the two waves were combined. And they arrived political power, and then they are kind of leaving because of this kind of neoconservative movement in many places. I think it's very, very different to evaluate the different contexts, and I think that's one of the most deeper problematics of this idea of finding common languages of struggle, because it makes things which are very different seem very similar. This is something activists work with. I spoke, for example, with, I didn't go into this because this was kind of a very particular case study, but there's a movement for housing rights, which was had a very characteristic typography, which has black letters on a yellow background. And then this was used by the group that did the first demonstration that led to the camp in Madrid, and then this was used in Occupy Wall Street. And in Occupy Wall Street, they said that they wanted to do this in order to give the idea that there was a global movement when there wasn't a global movement yet. So there's this idea of using the same visual language because there's no longer an overraking ideology as there was at other periods of history. So it's kind of the aesthetics substitute the manifesto, or they substitute the programmatic lines. And I think this idea is really, it has tactical use for activism, but it also can be misleading in order to understand the specificities. And the Arab Spring is such a different case to, for example, the Spanish example, or even the USA, or even, I think it was a very urban movement, for example, at least in Spain. So if you want to think about this in a small village and you want to think about this in Madrid or Barcelona, it's very different. So I think I should be very, very, very specific in evaluating the different consequences. And also I don't think it's exactly my role, because there's very strong geopolitical things crossing over, which are not only linked to national politics, but to international flows. For example, this idea of the colors, that they were used a lot in the color revolutions in the East, and Gene Sharp talked about the color revolutions, and Gene Sharp has been accused of being funded by the CIA. So you have all these competing lines, which are a bit like when I was talking about Reclaim the Street being spied upon. I really don't have the answer. I don't know if anyone does, but I don't.
Thank you. Chapadin?
Maybe I have the answer. Thank you very much again for a very inspiring presentation of very important acts of the protest. And I come from Georgia, and for me it was very interesting to see the parallels between the demonstrations in Georgia and whatever was happening in the UK. It was 2 years ago, before pandemic, when Georgian government decided to raid several clubs together in one night. It caused a lot of anger from young people, and they were protesting in front of parliament, which became basically like huge rave. So for the weekend it was like a crazy party in front of parliament. It was like a demonstration. It's ended well, actually. We gained whatever we were requesting from the government. But for me, the interesting fact is that the techno music or electronic music is always there to protest. Why is that? Like, why techno music and why not jazz? Or why not, I don't know, piano players or anything? Thank you.
Well, you actually have these, there was Zazouz, which was like a urban tribe during the French Nazi occupation, and they danced swing and were anti-fascist. So, I don't know, I think you can probably use it politically and use different musics politically. I think it's probably always been the case. And also, for example, in Spain, it was kind of the other way around. Techno music was kind of linked to right-wing politics in the 1990s, and now it's done a comeback in a very different and opposite direction. But there was this route, which was very linked to working class right-wing people, which had a lot of money because there was a construction boom. So suddenly they had a lot of money and they took a lot of drugs and they were part of this route. And it was kind of the opposite. So I think it's a bit like images, that they don't have like a clear ideology. You can repurpose it for different purposes. And Rosie, this woman, let me see if I can go to it. The woman who did the pink block, I really like it that she's still doing it. When Margaret Thatcher died, she dressed up like the bad witch in The Wizard of Oz. Because when Margaret Thatcher died, people started to vote for the #1, the song Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. So she dressed up as the witch, and she just launched herself into the crowd like this, from a very tall place. So she was in the newspaper and she was like saying, I trust people. I trust the people in this country, so I could have fallen, but I trust people. And she's still doing it. And John Jordan is now in the ZAD, which is this squatted farming area in France, where they wanted to build an airport. And there the music is also very important. The techno parties, they do solstice techno parties. So I think it's really interesting that one thinks there's this Adanism of thinking of things as appearing suddenly, but it's all part of a tradition. And I really like the idea of it being a tradition which is actually very long, very, very long, even longer than the 20th century. Thank you.
Well, I have a very small question about one particular slide with video and so on. Because you can see the Black Panther on the logo.
The what, sir?
Black Panther.
And which logo?
This video or something like that?
Video
and
again,
democracy.
democracy.
Which one, sir?
WTO and democracy.
So, oh, where's my note? Oh, no, it's not the Black Panther.
I think it
Was
was
the anarchist cat, no?
Let me see again.
Because
That's,
it refers to the particular group that was like left but quite extremist. And could you please...
no, it's the Rainforest Action Network. It was a...
yeah, like the name was different, but like logo refers to some particular group of people that also were of like ideology, but
Well, I don't know about their logo in particular. I really like this banner because it's transparent and it's really like doing an invention on the, the language of banners. But the organization is an ecological organization, and I think it's just a panther referring to this idea of extinct animals, because it's this environmentalism from the 1990s where we have WWF, which is a panda. This focus on the animals. So I'm not sure if the Black Panther thing is voluntary.
yeah, and also one small example, like in Ukraine we use like this red and black flag for nationalists, but not for anarchists, for example. And I don't know, sometimes these signs are not so widely used, and sometimes they're misleading because, for example, some for activists will come to Ukraine and see this, and this would be misunderstood.
Sorry, could you please speak louder and closer?
Yeah, it's the
Microphone
microphone.
closer to the mouth. Yeah, sorry.
Because sometimes the signs are not really worldwide, and can you please develop something on the particular examples of not global but domestic use?
Not global, but what, sorry?
Domestics, like used in smaller areas.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great contradictions of this topic in itself, You have a global environment, so of course you want to think about protests at least on certain occasions as something you can do globally, because that's kind of the scene that the media are in. But then at the same time, this is very problematic because, of course, it's always putting away the particularities and the differences when you try to find a common language for, all of the countries, all of the world. So it's like the anti-globalization movement, which wanted to speak of themselves more of a movement of movements, more than an anti-globalization movement, or a conjunction of global justice movements. At the same time, they have the risk, or they had the risk, or maybe we historians have the risk, maybe it's just a problem of looking back into the past, we have the risk of understanding it as a unified kind of language when there is already so many differences going on. And also, this has to do with the particularities of certain forms of protest, such as the counter-summits, in which people had to travel, had to take planes to go somewhere, so this meant that you either had money or you had the organizational means in order to go there. So there's this question of representation, who is there, where the camera is pointing, which demonstrations get to become part of this global vernacular of activism, which flags get to be part of this global vernacular of activism, and which flags are unknown in other places. So I think these are very complex questions which have to do with this idea of language, this aesthetical languages of politics.
Thank you very much. You described how every next circle of this mobilizations, international organizations like the Altered Globalist Movement, this Occupy and the Arab Spring Circle, further anti-austerity movements, how they reused many of the same slogans, aesthetics, again creativity. And again, there is a very common reference point about the 60s, the protests of the 1968. They were some outburst of this creativity, and especially the hippies in the US who use this carnival and humor and nominating Piglet for the president of the US and so on. But actually, can we say that it's something very specific for like these modern times, that it was like invented in the 60s as it's usually presented, or that actually we don't look very thoroughly on the previous protests, and maybe it's this tradition of carnival protest that was always inside any protest you have this creative, humorous and so on. So is it something unique or is it something really general?
Well, Reclaim the Streets, they're actually quite conscious of this dimension. They work, for example, with Bakhtin, which has this study of Rabelais, the writer, this story of this giant, and it's very funny story where everything is very exaggerated. And he speaks of the carnivalesque as a subversive form, and he was somebody who was proscribed by the Soviets because of this idea of how the carnivalesque is something which is revolutionary. And they also have these quotes. I didn't bring it here, but Reclaim the Streets had in their website a quote of something like, every revolution is a party, and every party is a revolution, and we want to erase the border between both. I think there's definitely this dimension to parties. I also think sometimes we kind of idealize parties, and you also have very commercial festivals which have nothing political in them. But regarding the question of how old these things are, I am now studying the 19th century counterculture, so that's kind of, I guess it's an answer.
Okay, thank you so much again for your presentations and for your answers. I have to say that we need to put comma here because we have to make a break.